I'd like to welcome our next witnesses, Mr Paul Brinkman, Mr Michael Rolfe and Councillor Linda Scott. Welcome. Could each of you, perhaps starting with you, Mr Brinkman, please state your name, position, title and swear either an oath or an affirmation.
Paul Brinkman, President of Regional Public Galleries New South Wales. I solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth.
Thank you. Mr Rolfe.
Thank you. Michael Rolfe, CEO of Museums and Galleries of New South Wales. I solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth.
Thank you. Councillor Scott.
Thank you. Councillor Linda Scott, President of Local Government New South Wales and a councillor on the City of Sydney. I solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth.
Thank you. Maybe starting with you, Mr Brinkman, are you interested in making a short opening statement?
Yes, please. Brinkman. Regional Public Galleries New South Wales is proud to present the public gallery sector at this inquiry and to further expand on our written submission, particularly in relation to Section B of the inquiry's terms of reference. The bushfires, closely followed by COVID-19, have dramatically fractured many of our regional communities, and in these difficult times we have seen the important role public galleries play in supporting communities to maintain a sense of place, pride and hope while they rebuild. Galleries are places of refuge, both physical and mental. They are safe places, inspiring places, reflective places and nurturing places. The regional gallery sector of New South Wales represents approximately 121 cultural oases scattered across the state. The recently released results of the Creating Our Future National Arts Participation Survey provides tangible evidence of the value of the arts to Australians, with 98% of Australians engaged in the arts in 2019. Clearly, the arts is ingrained in who we are as a nation, and therefore there is a need for the New South Wales State Government to do all it can to support public galleries as a major part of arts infrastructure. This is not a choice, it is an obligation of all levels of government to the many and varied communities across New South Wales. While local governments are increasingly doing the heavy lifting in this space, accounting for more than 46% of the running costs of the sector, the state government's commitment has dropped to 13%. When is the time, if not now, to start providing significant, valuable and timely support to public galleries in regional areas? As regional galleries wait for the results of the 2020-21 Create New South Wales Local Government Arts and Cultural Funding Program, the sector as a whole is looking for a better, more strategic and nuanced system of support. The sector needs strong leadership from the state government, with a support mechanism that public galleries can rely upon. The system of support for libraries is a sound example of what could be implemented for the regional gallery sector to provide this surety. A legislated per capita subsidy has been in place for libraries since 1939, enabling the library sector to flourish across the state. Meanwhile, the arts sector continues to face an ever-changing piecemeal funding landscape, with at best a maximum of 3 years of funding support. I urge this inquiry to not, yet again, focus its gaze squarely on the Powerhouse Museum, and see that the arts sector across New South Wales is desperately seeking long-term, sustained and reliable support from the state government in order to meet the needs of communities. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Mr Rolfe.
Thank you, Chair. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Gadigal people as the traditional owners of this land and pay my respects to their elders past, present and future. Presenting as I am with Local Government New South Wales and Regional Galleries New South Wales, I wanted to keep this introduction focused on MG's support for the Community Museum and Aboriginal Cultural Centre sectors and reinforce this submission support for the Powerhouse Parramatta project and recently announced intention for it to keep operating at the Ultimo site. Local government has much to be proud of in its vision and service delivery across New South Wales. Because of this involvement, our regional galleries and equivalent museums are strong in their visioning and community engagement activities statewide, and have been for over 100 years. COVID brings to the fore a long-held need for an overarching museum strategy for the state, as it has highlighted, among many things, the extraordinary estimated 100 million per annum contribution of volunteers right across our sector, now at a risk of being severely diminished. Pre-COVID, there was an undenied case for more recurrent resources for people, skills, knowledge and programs on the ground to support work discussed here. Post-COVID, post-bushfires, that argument has become critical. New South Wales Aboriginal people know the challenges of dislocation, of cultural loss, and it has been intensely humbling for my organisation to be working with the Aboriginal Cultural Heritage and Arts Association, otherwise known as ACHA, helping its member organisations reclaim cultural knowledge and ownership. Their work is ongoing and an important part of this conversation. It is perhaps ironic that the urgent concerns we share for settler histories and beyond can learn from the magnitude and impact of Aboriginal people's loss. As flagged, MNG, in our submission, the pandemic and climate change have indeed upended things, and while we noted some impacts, there is still a lot to play out in what we see as a long-tail challenge to the sector's cultural knowledge, volunteer involvements, vital collection care, storytelling and audience engagement activities. Which brings me to Powerhouse Parramatta. It is a visionary project, and in saying that, I include and commend the recent decision to maintain programming and operations at Ultimo. Powerhouse Parramatta will invigorate Sydney. In so doing, it will embrace Australia's demographic future and clearly signpost the role of and opportunities presented by cultural institutions in communities throughout New South Wales. Thank you.
Ms. Scott.
Thanks, Chair. I too would like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation on whose land we meet today, and thank the committee for the opportunity to appear. Local governments run institutions are the backbone of cultural life in our state. For so many of our art, museum and heritage organisations across New South Wales, local government is the primary source of operational funding and also, most commonly, the owner of the buildings in which these organisations operate. We know of the recent study of 377 art, museum and heritage organisations surveyed in 2018, 75% said that local government was their primary source of funding. Of course, councils do not only run museums and galleries, they also own and manage theatres, event spaces, libraries and other public space through which the culture of communities is cultivated and on which state, federal and independent touring exhibits and performances rely. We acknowledge that this inquiry may feed into a nationwide conversation about the role of the creative industry in the recovery of local economies and community wellbeing post this pandemic, and local government is well placed to drive this locally led recovery. The cultural sector is one of the first industries to largely be put on hold due to public health restrictions limiting gatherings this March. Despite this, funding support from state and federal governments to local government has so far been very limited. Councils have stepped up to respond to assist local facilities and artists with, for example, a wide range of arts grants and virtual touring. In post-pandemic recovery, it will be vital to provide much greater investment at the local government level to help restore these sectors and the vibrancy they bring to communities. This will require three main actions from the New South Wales Government. The first is to broaden the funding so that councils can more easily apply for needs other than infrastructure, capital or one-off projects. Councils have told Local Government New South Wales that funding is lacking for the ongoing facility operations, curatorial development, training and equipment for digitisation and virtual exhibits, and employee costs and retention. Secondly, state and federally owned institutions should assist by sharing their knowledge and collections across the state by loaning staff and exhibits more freely and fairly, of course, still valuing locally meaning input to exhibits. And finally, state and federal governments should have a renewed strategic focus on arts and cultural projects. At our 2019 local government conference, councils resolved to call on the state government to develop a New South Wales museum strategy, moved by Councillor Jess Jennings from Bathurst Council. Importantly, councils called for this strategy to be accompanied by sufficient resources to ensure collections and stories are developed and maintained for communities throughout the state. I welcome the focus of this committee, recognising the fundamental importance of communities of arts and cultural development, infrastructure and initiatives, and look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Questions?
Mr. Chair, my first line of questions there is to Mr. Brinkman. Mr. Brinkman, in your submission, you talk about funding for regional museums and galleries is, quote, competitive. So do you assist or advise or provide advice to regional or public galleries seeking government funding?
Certainly, as the peak body for regional galleries, we're on hand to provide advice to anybody looking to apply for any funding. But can I say that the majority of directors across the state are very au fait with applying for grants.
When you say au fait, would they recognize the importance of meeting a deadline?
Definitely.
Definitely. Are you familiar with something called the Regional Cultural Fund?
Yes. Yep.
You may not have been in the room, but previously we had some evidence from the Create New South Wales infrastructure person, and I put to her that 4 of 7 applications that were submitted after the deadline for the project for the Regional Cultural Fund were actually approved. Do you advise your members to make submissions after deadlines have closed, or do you encourage them to meet the deadlines?
Well, that's a practical implication of Smarty grants, which most grant applications that are applied for go through. And my understanding is that you can't apply after the cut-off date. There's not an opportunity to put an application in for most grant rounds.
Are you saying because it's an online application process, if you go to submit your grant to the online portal and it's after the application date, you can't upload it? That's
how Smarty grants works, yes.
Thank you, Ms. Jackson, for that. So what do you advise? You actually talk about it being very competitive. So what do you advise your members that if they have a project that wants to be funded, do you encourage them to go through the proper process?
Definitely, yeah,
Right.
yes.
Okay, so when they're doing that process, what advice do you provide to them on providing a case for a grant?
There are a number of different grant schemes that are an opportunity that galleries can apply to, and each of those different grants often have a different type of focus. So we urge all of our members to...
Can I take you to the Regional Cultural Fund?
Specifically the
Yeah.
Regional Cultural Fund?
Yeah.
I would say that was a fairly generalised fund, so we recommend that all of our members, if they ask us, then is to provide very detailed information of their project. Timelines, budgets are extremely important, and resources that they're able to commit, often in kind, to those kind of projects.
Do they spend a lot of time and effort to lodge an application for this?
Just like every other grant application, grant applications do require an awful lot of effort and time that goes into application processes, often usually with fairly limited staffing in these regional spaces to enable that. So often that's the role of senior curators or directors in institutions to put in the application.
So it occupies a lot of their time when they actually should be, I guess, engaging in curatorial activities, working with the community, that they actually have to divert a significant amount of their time and resources to engage in the application process.
Thus, it has always been.
Certainly.
But I'm just going to the point of, in his evidence, he said
Always
it was very competitive. So I just want to make the point that there are procedures that you go through. 42 museums and galleries shared 42 million. And of those 42 galleries, 3 were in Liberal Party electorates, and they were approved after the deadline. So how do you think that, how would your members feel if they had spent time, energy, resources to make an application in good faith, worked very diligently to meet all the criteria?
Point of order.
I'm just asking, what is the
I'm
response
I'm
from
making
his
a point of order.
constituents?
I understand. I'm making a point of order. Mr. Chair, my point of order is this. I think that this line of questioning is potentially very unfair. What's happening now is there's a slight being directed, a clearly implied, in fact, I would say stated slight against these organisations that put in late.
Freedom of information. It's not a slight.
Well,
It's documents
no, just
right
please
here.
finish my point.
Documents right here.
And the point is this may be very unfair on these organisations because there may have been a perfectly good reason that they put in applications late. Maybe their computer crashed and they put it in 10 minutes afterwards because they had to fax it instead of submitting. I don't know is my point. And I don't think it's fair that the member continues to say and allege that there was some sort of inappropriate activity by these very hard-working regional cultural organisations. I mean, the evidence we've already heard today and throughout the inquiry is that they find it tough enough to exist in this space. And to have these sorts of allegations, I think, is grossly unfair. And I ask you to call the member to order and to ask him to redirect his line of questioning, to take away those
I will
allegations.
call the member to order.
Okay. Just to give context after that, so would you consider Manning Entertainment Centre to be a tiny cultural organization? That is a large cultural body. Are they one of the members? Are they? I don't know the answer to this. Is the Manning Entertainment Centre part of your organization?
No, we're regional and public galleries.
The regional public galleries.
Which is
So-
the
Okay.
actual, the whole reason that this committee's meeting to talk about galleries and museums.
But they put forward, maybe I'll follow up a freedom of information on this. Why is an entertainment gallery, why is an entertainment gallery seeking, do you find it extraordinary that an entertainment center is trying to secure funding from a body that in fact should be directed at your members?
My understanding is Manning Art Gallery is a member of our organisation, so that's all I can say on that.
Have you had any discussions with the Powerhouse Museum on loaning parts of the Powerhouse collection to rural and regional galleries?
Not as an organisation, individual galleries that would be looking to loan works for particular exhibitions would approach the larger institutions individually.
Are you aware of any approaches at the moment?
No.
Mr. Rolfe, are you aware of any loaning parts of the Powerhouse Gallery to rural and regional galleries?
No, but I am aware that there's a distinct interest from regional New South Wales for collection loans and for object loans. And I understand that through commentary from this committee and in other areas that some approaches have been made for loans from the collection specific to this period of transition. So I think it's a great thing. The demand is for object loans and touring exhibitions, and it's a wonderful opportunity for regional New South Wales to share in those treasures.
Mm-hmm. Ms. Scott, do your members express concern to you about the amount of time they have to, local councils have to divert or extend to government application process?
They do. They certainly would appreciate more certainty about funding, given that councils are rate capped in New South Wales. It provides a very limited ability, other than through other grant funding, for them to manage their own budgets and understand the implications of what might need to go forward. So it's an imposition of time, and certainly recurring block funding would provide councils more certainty and more of an ability to allow these kinds of institutions to thrive where they run or own the buildings.
Ms. Scott, this will be my final question. Ms. Scott, in your opening address, you talked about the need for a New South Wales museum strategy. And I wrote down quickly some of the suggestions you made: digitalization, employee costs. So you want to see more than simply bricks and mortar funding.
That's correct.
What's your rationale behind funding employee costs?
Well, we, for example, councils, unlike much of the rest of the economy, were not eligible for the federal government's JobKeeper program, and so it has put councils under an enormous amount of stress financially in order to maintain the support for our employees, particularly with a range of arts and cultural institutions that, as I said, have been shut down from March this year, and many unable to reopen due to social distancing requirements.
Ms. Scott, you mentioned about difficult.
I'm not quite sure if Ms. Scott had entirely finished.
Okay,
I
go.
thought that might have been her first point.
Okay. I know Linda well.
We would like to see a museum strategy that supports the importance of museums to communities, the importance of local governments to museums, and then provides funding for a range of different mechanisms to ensure they can stay open. My final quick point is that local government funding continues to increase for these kinds of activities, as opposed to state and federal funding, which continues to decrease. And so the proportion of funding, even though I note others have stated local government funding in regional areas, for example, was about 46%, this is creeping up higher and higher each year.
Mm-hmm. Now, in your answer to me, you referred to employees. So have local councils during COVID been forced to shed cultural workers, arts workers, gallery workers?
I don't have specific examples of where local governments have had to shed those kinds of jobs, but we do know that in local areas they have come under enormous pressure in the absence of the provision of JobKeeper to local governments. And we know that these industries support a huge amount of jobs. So, for example, in the Northern Beaches Council area, the closure of venues, organisations and cancellation of activities threatens up to 7,000 jobs and more than 2,500 creative businesses. So the creative ecosystems that are built around these kinds of sectors and the impact of COVID is threatening jobs in a range of local government areas.
Thank you, Rose.
Thank you. I just wanted to ask, perhaps following up on a question that my colleague, Mr. Secord, asked. Ms. Scott, you mentioned a strategy, an overall strategy for regional galleries in New South Wales. I think a previous iteration of this committee has made a recommendation about an overall museum strategy for New South Wales as well. I wondered if you, but Mr. Rolfe and Mr. Brinkman may wish to comment as well. Why do you think that's important? What do you see as the benefit of taking a step back and having a broader strategic approach to obviously regional galleries, but also probably museums and galleries overall in New South Wales, as opposed to more bitty, more project, more gallery by gallery, piece by piece, either funding or support as the case may be? Why is that something that you think would be beneficial?
It's beneficial. It's a widely held view in the local government sector. As I said, it was moved by Bathurst Council, Broken Hill and a range of others, and was strongly supported at our conference. We think it's important to have a museum strategy for New South Wales because it could, for example, talk to the issues that many museums are having about the pressure to continue, look at the diversity of population in an area and ensure that their cultural needs are being represented through museums, consider the funding and ongoing financial sustainability of many museums, which is currently not being considered in a strategic way. As I noted, look at collections, digitisation of those, sharing of those in a more strategic way, and also look to the importance of local government provision of these museums and the impact, should there be more financial instability in local government, of those kinds of things closing down without further support.
Did any other witness wish to
I can just say that it's extremely important that the regional gallery sector is very focused on building strong relationships with their communities. regional galleries plan 3, 4, 5 years in advance for their exhibition programs, but also for their public programs, their community programs. The existing funding situation being short-term project-based means some fantastic work gets done and then it just stops. And there's fantastic opportunities to build on that and to grow that so our communities can really benefit from their regional galleries, and having more surety around long-term funding rather than single-year or 2-year funding would really benefit the long-term prosperity of our industry.
Could I just ask a follow-up question?
Yeah, of course.
And it's really directed to all. Do you think there is... Do you put galleries and museums into the same bucket and say the same approach should be taken to funding for both? Or do you think there is a difference between the regional galleries and museums? The reason I say that is my perception is that the regional galleries have a certain model, a consistent model, at least in the towns that I visit, whereas the galleries are a much more diverse group.
The museums.
Sorry, the museums are a much more diverse entity, I suppose, than the regional museums.
If I may,
Yeah.
take that. The strategy really is about a framework that covers the sector, the museum and gallery sector that we speak of. Some 500 entities in New South Wales. 2/3 of those are in regional New South Wales. It's about identifying and supporting the differences within those organisations, and as you correctly point out, local government aligned and professionally staffed museums and galleries are operating at a sophisticated level and have for some time. They are resource stretched. It is about recurrent funding. It's about people, skills, knowledge, programs on the ground. But then there are the volunteer and community museums that are essentially volunteer run. They are custodians on average of 10,000 items in collections. They're collections that are focused on local stories, local histories, local people. They're all about community well-being. Their benefits are about community well-being, about economic benefits. They're about the storytelling and capacity of those places. The framework would identify those subsets, and the framework should identify the support mechanisms that are needed, that are different, but that are needed to support and ensure the ongoing viability and contribution of those places to what we want and know about regional New South Wales. And I hasten to add there too the Aboriginal cultural centres and keeping places as part of that matrix. That's how we see the framework and the strategy being determined and being described and benefiting the sector
Could I,
as a whole.
sorry for being late, I was fighting the oppressive machinery of the state somewhere else.
How did it go?
Oh, I didn't succeed on my
All right.
application.
I didn't know Dan Murphy's constituted...
That's such a subtle joke that I missed
Leave
it
that
all.
alone.
I was going to ask about the strategy that we see from Museums Victoria, and Museums Victoria is probably, I think, the largest museums sort of organisation in the country. It's got a very clear strategy. It continues to put forward clear strategy. Do you think that would be a good blueprint for New South Wales?
It's not what we're talking about here. It is focused on museums as in a cultural heritage sense. We're talking about a strategy that is more all-encompassing for New South Wales. And we're talking about a much larger sector than Victoria. So there are, with that size, more complexity to consider. So it's a good idea that there's a model and we can reference how government takes this on. But it is more complex, both demographically and geographically in New South Wales.
Well,
Councils would welcome a specific museum strategy that was geared towards the sector that is our museums. And we think that that is necessary because whilst the sector is very diverse, it is a sector in need of support. Some of you may have, like me, visited, for example, the Brewarrina Aboriginal Museum, a tiny little museum on the banks of the river there that are right next to their world leading Indigenous fish traps. They're quite a remarkable sight, and the tiny museum there to celebrate literally tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of years of settlement on that site and explain the history of that. That is a place that is supported by the local government of the area in one of the most disadvantaged parts of our state. Without a museum strategy specifically to cover that, the Powerhouse Museum and everything in between, I fear for the future of our museums in New South Wales.
I mean, that's an extraordinary institution, and they can't even get the funding to remove those ugly concrete barriers just outside and actually link the museum with the fish traps. It's so frustrating. But I think if we try and pull together a collective museums and galleries strategy, it may be that you're trying to do too much. You've got disparate, you'll be pulled in different directions. Maybe we need a distinct museums strategy and a distinct galleries strategy because we're going to have different strengths and needs in those two areas. What do people think?
Could be an argument that that is the outcome of this process. But we did talk about a framework, and the framework that would take into account the needs across the sector. When you're talking about digitisation and a proposed regional program to achieve that, we're talking about taking images of collection items. So there are overlaps in the sector of that kind, but there are also distinct differences. So I wouldn't paint it as black and white as that for this to be achieved.
Mr. Rolfe, in your opening statement, you talked about supporting the Powerhouse Parramatta development.
Yes.
Is that your personal view, or is that the view of your board and your membership?
We're not a membership organisation.
Is that the view of you or your board?
The submission was written by me and it was run past my chair who distributed it to the board. So yes, it is a position that I think everyone was very comfortable with.
And is the nature of your support specific to the proposal that is currently being put forward by the government, or are you aware of the alternative proposal to build a Parramatta powerhouse, for example, at the Cumberland Hospital campus?
No, we are particularly focused on what is proposed at the moment.
Despite the concerns that have been raised, for example, around the flooding of the site, the impact on heritage properties on the site, the access to the site, those are things that don't concern you?
No.
And so despite the fact that there is an alternative site just down the road...
Well, there's an assertion of an alternative site.
The business case has been put together just down the road that doesn't have any of those concerns.
We are focused on what's proposed.
And that's just because that is what's proposed? That's the reason that you're focused on it? Or why have you narrowed your
Well, I mean,
as to the specific proposal from the government as opposed to alternative proposals?
we're focused on what's proposed because it's bringing a major cultural institution to the centre of Sydney. We're focused on it because of its access and equity. And we're focused on access and equity across the state. And we see this as a great project, I mean, a truly significant project for Sydney that will enable, in a very real way, the impact of cultural institutions in communities throughout the state. So we're focused on the access, the equity, and on the fact that we are delivering a reinvigorated major cultural institution to the demographic heart of this great city.
I mean, I don't think anyone is actually opposed to the idea of building a world-class facility called Parramatta Powerhouse, if that was the preferred name or some other name.
No, I don't think that's the
in
evidence.
Parramatta. I don't think any
I don't think
witness-
anyone sitting around
I
this
don't
table
think
No.
is
well,
opposed to it.
whether we want to limit it to people around this table or in fact evidence that we've heard, I don't actually think I've heard one witness
You have.
oppose the idea of building a cultural facility in Parramatta.
Oh, we're
I
broadening
think,
it now.
I think that the issue is
Order.
the site of that facility and whether there are in fact preferable sites to the one that the government has put forward that don't have any of the risks, real risks attendant on the current proposal.
I'll always advocate for these places to be in the centre of town.
Could I, Mr. Rolfe, you say you're not a membership-based organisation,
No.
and your funding comes from the New South Wales government and the federal government, is that right?
We get some funding from the federal government. We have some self-earned income through our touring exhibition programs. We have some philanthropic support, but our operational support, our key operational support, does come through Create New South Wales.
And your organisation is designed to help small and medium museums and galleries and Aboriginal cultural centres. That's your primary
Right,
mission.
we directly work and we act as a conduit with them to connect with the cultural institutions as well.
What do you say then to all of those small and medium museums and galleries that are desperate for funding for the most basic things, sometimes fixing the toilets, stopping the roof leaking? What do you say to them about the opportunity cost of such a huge amount of public funding going into just one institution like this and just moving it? What do you say about that opportunity cost to those small and medium museums and galleries that you represent?
We say there should be that money and more. We recognise their need, but it's not an either or.
Yeah.
Well, can you identify where the additional funds will come from?
The additional funds, from my perspective, should come from government because of the magnitude of the benefits that these organisations provide.
So you don't recognise the complexity for you as an advocate of small and medium-sized museums and galleries, the complexity of supporting such a huge chunk of the cultural spend going to just one very large institution? You don't recognise even the complexity in that position you have?
I don't approach it in that way. I think that there should be more money overall for the sector.
I might ask a couple of questions, if I may. Sorry, unless it was specifically
Oh, no,
on
I'm
that.
sorry,
Well, if it's a
Mr.
follow-on
Schubert.
from this, I'll go to Walt.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. If it's a follow-on,
Thank you,
that's fine.
Mr. Schubert. Mr. Rolfe, so are you familiar with the Regional Cultural Fund?
Point of order.
It
I mean, this is very clearly not a follow-on from the specific line of
is.
questioning that you're engaged in.
I'll give you a very brief opportunity to bring it back, and so
in line with what Mr.
You're
Schubert.
outrageous. You really are.
No, Mr. Schubert was. I actually thought that Mr.
just
Schubert.
ask the question.
I thought he was
Just ask the
leaning
question.
towards this.
Well, you most definitely cannot read my mind. Walt, so, but I'll just ask the
Sorry,
question.
you're acting like a hostile chair. I'm
Ask
sorry.
the question. Ask the question.
Okay, Mr. Rolfe, in line with Mr. Schubert's comment about all the expenditure going to one single cultural institution, are you comfortable with what you've heard and read and heard earlier today about the Regional Cultural Fund and people submitting applications, 42 projects approved, but 4 of those missed the deadline?
Point of order.
Well, I think I need to hear the end of the question.
Oh,
and then I'll deal with
sorry,
the point of
he's
order.
been on this for a long time.
You know, I got a summary. By the way.
Okay, are you comfortable with the way the government handles and distributes funds through the Regional Cultural Fund?
So I would just make a point of order. I'm sorry, Mr. Rolfe. It's just this. This is clearly an entirely new line of questioning. The government hasn't had any questions yet.
It emanates from Mr. Schubert's
And I had
question,
asked
actually.
first.
Mr.
and
Franklin, can I say just the most efficient way to deal with this is we get this answer, and then straight after that answer, I'll go to you.
I'm
So-
comfortable with that.
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
That's a chair. Okay.
Firstly, there were more than 42 organisations successful. I think it was closer to 80 or so. There was $100 million in 2 tranches. I think your question refers to one.
There were 42 museums and galleries.
Yes,
is the
42.
evidence that-
42
That was
museums and
evidence from
Yep.
this morning, yes.
Yep. Okay. So, yeah, I'm comfortable. Yeah.
You're comfortable with it? Thank you very much.
Mr. Franklin.
Well, you're right, Mr. Chair. I take off my hat to you, sir.
I'm going to you, Mr. Franklin, your question.
No, thank you very much. There are two issues I want to talk about. First is digitisation, which Councillor Scott, you referred to it, but obviously this is a very important issue, and I'm sure all three of you have views you'd like to put on the table, particularly, obviously, under the time in which we live in terms of COVID. I don't know if any of you were here when the previous witnesses from Create New South Wales talked about the implementation and introduction of a hub and spoke model for digitisation, that major facilities, regional galleries, regional museums would be charged and funded to start the digitisation process for their collections and also to work with the smaller museums and galleries around them. I guess I wanted to ask what your views were about that, and what else needs to be done in this space. I'm specifically, rather than more funds, this morning we had a commitment that this is being rolled out. I'm just interested for practical recommendations in the area of digitisation, which I think is utterly critical in terms of both equity of access and in terms of historical record preservation and obviously cultural preservation. Yeah, perhaps we'll start with you, Mr. Brinkman.
I certainly agree. Digitisation of collections is very, very important, despite the challenges of changing technologies always affecting that. And having the resources available to not only digitise a collection but do it in the correct software programs that will have some longevity. Certainly from a regional gallery perspective, and I speak from a regional gallery sector.
Your Blue Mountains?
Sorry?
We're
Blue Mountains, yes, myself. Many regional galleries already have digitised their collections. I do think that maybe Mr. Rolfe's better at answering that question from a museum perspective, because my understanding is many of the smaller volunteer museums do struggle with digitising their collections, whereas the gallery sector is probably better across that area.
Yep.
Yes, and as Paul correctly notes, we've been working quite actively with Create New South Wales and with the sector on the Regional Cultural Fund application that we made for collections and stories, and for regional digitisation, and the follow on from that designed or delivered an idea for the hub and spoke approach to regional digitisation, and primarily for small museum collections. One of the reasons why we highlight the potential for this loss with COVID and bushfires, the impact that's happening there, the disassociation between objects and stories, and the volunteer drop-off, the connection that people have, the knowledge they have. We want to use this process to document, to assess the significance of those objects, and to digitise them and make them available, and to give that information back to communities as a powerful tool. It's been identified that hub and spoke is the best way to deliver that, to have people on the ground, to have programs on the ground, to have skills and knowledge on the ground to achieve that locally.
Do you have any other specific recommendations that you'd like this committee to consider in terms of the digitisation issue that you don't think have been considered at this point by government?
Working with creators we have, and there is a proposal currently in its final stages. Like a lot of these things, whether or not there are going to be sufficient resources for the full allocation of documentation and digitisation to occur. As I said, I mean, on average, these small organisations have 10,000 objects in collections. It takes a while to go through that work, and whether we can actually achieve that with what is available at the moment, but hopefully the success of it, and I'm very confident that it will lead to an ongoing program.
Great. Councillor Scott, did you want to add anything?
Look, of course, we would support state government moves to have a more consistent approach to digitisation. So we do hope that some consistent approach that would offer council some guidance about, for example, a consistent technology solution that would enable more sharing. You know, councils would welcome that. As I said in my opening statement, the critical aspect here is, though, funding. And so without the broadening of the base for funding, it does make it very challenging. So many council venues remain closed, and it's difficult to map a path out of that closure at the moment, given that we don't have certainty about the future of COVID. And so it it is going to mean that the funding priorities for councils will largely be focused on trying to retain their staff. And so without broadening of the base for funding, that makes that digitisation project, which may, for example, require, the procurement of technology or a range of other costs, very, very challenging for local governments to undertake.
Yeah, understood. I'll take that point and just ask if any of the three of you would like to comment further about the impacts of COVID on your sector. I hear you in terms of what you say in terms of the staffing and the funding issues, but if there are any other points that you want us to consider in our recommendations, obviously the landscape has now changed considerably. And Mr. Rolfe, I noted particularly your comments about the likely and possibly permanent reduction in volunteer activity in community museums particularly. If any of you have any thoughts about recommendations that we should consider within this new COVID world that we find ourselves.
The impact is ongoing, and as I also said, it's long tail. It's unpredicted. It's not happened and gone. Volunteering is a huge resource for staffed organisations and for community-run, volunteer-run, for Aboriginal participation as well. We need to keep an eye on that. There is going to be, we think, a significant loss. There may be a need for some kind of collection rescue program to be undertaken where significant objects are salvaged, secured, cared for, where some of these smaller places may indeed fall over.
So because the museums might shut, suddenly you find that these objects aren't being cared for in the appropriate way. Yeah.
We've already had one instance of a small museum being broken into, an object stolen in the lockdown period. We know that there was significant dust, and it wasn't a lot of fire destruction for collections, but dust and deterioration of that kind through that period last summer. So there is always, as we say, this idea of a collection rescue is something I think that's going to become crucial to ensure that these connections and objects and stories are maintained.
Thank you.
Did you finish?
Just making sure that the other two didn't have anything to add on that, on COVID.
Just to say, the challenges for the gallery sector is that the community is looking for more from their regional galleries. Communities are staying home; they're not travelling, so they're looking at things to do within their local community, and empowering their communities is something that galleries do. So the challenges, though, for local governments is, as was mentioned before, staffing. So most regional galleries, they've let go of their casual staff, and of course the staffing matrix is quite casualised within the arts sector as a whole. Part-timers are really struggling for hours, and many councils are taking the opportunity to reduce the opening hours of their facilities in order to try and save some costs.
And in fact, we need the converse.
That's it.
David.
Councillor Scott, one of the responses that local government has taken to ever diminishing real funding from state and federal level to museums and galleries has been to consolidate the within councils the museums and the galleries as a single unit, and tend to run them with the same staff, and to produce efficiencies and reduce the costs of running a museum and a gallery. Is that the case?
Yeah.
And I could refer to a couple of reports on this, including some detailed studies in 2018 that was showing that.
Look, I don't pretend to have detailed knowledge in 2020 about that because, frankly, there's been a lot local governments are doing, so I don't have details about that. I can say, though, we have as policy and are advocating for a specific standalone museum strategy to ensure that they're considered in that way.
Well, in that regard, I mean, there was the study that I was reading yesterday by Helena Robinson on cultural policy, local government and museums actually goes through the New South Wales local government sector and says that's her observation, that's the local government response, consolidating the workforce to spread over both museums and galleries, and perfectly reasonable in terms of the crunch on funding, but then the loss of individual expertise in museums and galleries. Mr. Brinkman, Mr. Rolfe? Do either of you have any observations about that?
Yes, I know Helena's report, and I think from memory it was written around the time that there was what we call convergence being considered, and it was played out in
It was June 2018.
yeah, it was published, but it was written before that, I think. But it had as an opportunity to discuss Albury, which was pursuing a converged model for its museum and gallery operations. They've since untangled. It has proved to be, I mean, they're different beasts. As I mentioned in my answer to a question earlier, there's some overlap in terms of collection care that can happen, but their ways of working and their programming, the visual arts and cultural heritage, they're different beasts. The identities of these places, the personalities that they have are different. Albury has untangled and it's going gangbusters. There are not too many others, I don't think. I think there's a realisation of the strength. If you have a regional gallery, you want a regional gallery. If you have a regional museum or a community museum, you want that too. It's the personality of place, the skills and the knowledge and the professionalism is different.
So we come back to that. They're very distinct entities with very distinct purposes and very distinct skills, and they should be treated as such.
That's right.
Mr. Brinkman?
I wholeheartedly agree. I would find that you'd find very few museum specialists or gallery specialists that would actually see very much overlap between the two professions. Yes, they're both charged with collections often, but I think you would find that across the state, in fact across Australia, you would see a lot more convergence from a facilities point of view between libraries and galleries. There are many, many examples where local governments have constructed cultural precincts that have included a library and a gallery just as much as a museum and a gallery.
That's an element in the study that I was referring to. They talk about libraries, galleries and museums.
Yeah, but I wouldn't say that necessarily they're operational, at an operational level they are intermingled. Certainly at a facilities and a location level they may well be. But their methodology is quite different.
Have you noticed that trend in local government-run facilities, a convergence, not just a physical convergence, but a staffing convergence as part of the response to the enormous cost pressures councils find them under?
I would say there's been most galleries that are constructed in recent times have been associated with another institution like a library or museum, but no, I haven't seen a trend between professions intermingling between museums and galleries.
I just had one last question. Mr. Brinkman, I wanted to put to you a question similar to one that my colleague Mr. Shoebridge put to Mr. Rolfe, just around the reflection of you and your members on, in some ways, the core question of this inquiry, which is we have this substantial amount of money, at least $840 million in capital expenditure, let alone the recurrent costs of running now the two powerhouse facilities in Sydney and Parramatta.
So I thought we were all on side about the Parramatta Powerhouse. We're now not?
We are on side. I think I can
we're all on
fairly
side.
acknowledge that it costs money.
Well, I think we're all on side about an extraordinary, positive, world-class cultural facility in Parramatta.
Should we let
So
Ms Jackson?
on the one hand, Mr. Brinkman, we have that commitment of expenditure for those two facilities. And on the other hand, we have the evidence of yourself, and Ms. Scott confirmed it as well, around the much more limited funding provided on a very short-term basis to regional galleries. And I just really wanted to put to you directly, what is the view of you and your members on that specific inequity, in a way?
Look, most of our members are extremely enthusiastic about an additional site in Parramatta servicing Western Sydney. And I agree with Michael that ideally we'd like to see that plus additional regional funding. I think it is a very emotive issue at the moment because so many of our members are really struggling. And so, to be honest, within the sector, most of our members really aren't thinking very hard about the powerhouse at the moment. They're thinking very hard about how they can open their doors next week and how they can get through this current crisis. So, Yes, it's obvious that a lot of money is being spent on this institution. I support, and our members support, the existence of any additional cultural institutions that are able to tell the stories of our state. At the same time, we really do need more regional support, and not only more regional support, but probably more importantly, some surety rather than short-term project-based grant money, something that we can look at 2, 3, 4, 5 years down the track and be able to tell our councils there is support that exists, so it is worthwhile continuing to support because we also have the support of the state government.
Great.
There are a number of multi-year funding streams as well.
To a maximum of about 3 years.
Yeah.
Just, Ms Scott, I just wanted to ask you, we don't have much time left, just with your City of Sydney councillor hat on, just about the future of the Ultimo site. So obviously it's very pleasing. I'm sure we had evidence from the Lord Mayor supporting the government's announcement to maintain the Powerhouse Ultimo, as it were. But there's
And enthusiastic evidence from the General Manager.
enthusiastic evidence from everyone supporting the Powerhouse Ultimo. But there has been some confusion, perhaps, about what actually that looks like. And the final business case is yet to be released, as I'm sure you know. So what are your views about the future of that site? And in particular, if I might ask about, say, propositions to, say, transition it into some kind of lyric theatre or some kind of, quite alternative vision to the current Powerhouse Museum that's operating there?
Well, as a City of Sydney councillor, I obviously support strongly the retention of having a powerhouse cultural institution in Ultimo. It was very disappointing under a previous government policy where there was a pitting of really places like Ultimo in the City of Sydney against Parramatta, and so it is welcome that there is a standalone now government commitment, as I understand it, to fund and operate a cultural institution of their own in Parramatta, and I understand that's something the Parramatta Lord Mayor and Council strongly support. I do think there is a continued need for a very strong, thriving cultural institution such as the current Powerhouse Museum existing in Ultimo. I've certainly gone there with my children. We know thousands and thousands of other resident families in the City of Sydney visit there, and of course so many global visitors that come to Sydney from around the world, or even in COVID times from around the state, continue to want to visit the Powerhouse in Ultimo. So I would not want it to see I would not want to see it converted into a site that wasn't a very similar business model to the one that it currently has.
Thank you. That's all from me.
I think we're out of time.
We've got one
I think
question.
we're out of time. Councillor Scott, you indicated that there are a number of regional councils that are very much under pressure. Are there any councils that have told you that they're at the brink of potentially mothballing or shutting some of their regional museums? Are there some that should be front of mind?
I don't have permission to name them, but yes.
Right, would you mind taking that on notice? And then you can consult.
Yep.
Thanks.
Okay, thanks very much. We'll call a break there for